So, let's talk about building dungeons. When building a dungeon, it's useful to first think of a story for the player to build in their head as they explore it. A dungeon with a strong narrative for the player is more likely to be memorable to them. A clear narrative in the player's mind is, I believe, the key to every great level. Now, a narrative isn't always necessarily like a story with dialogue and characters. It can be very abstract. It just needs to be a context the player has in mind that colors their experience as they explore. Using something like this as a guiding point is useful, and it can help you make decisions later. If you're unsure about something, ask yourself, does it build a narrative? Does it build this narrative, or does it detract from it? So, the most basic kind of level narrative is the player-centric narrative. So what is the player doing here? Think of this one in the first person. So for instance, I am exploring a mysterious castle ruins to find treasure, or I'm sneaking into a laboratory of a mad wizard to foil his experiments. Something terrifying is stalking me through this abandoned village. I am captive of a cursed jail and need to break out. I'm getting lost in a darkly beautiful forest and I hear wolves howling. Right? That's the kind of narrative here. It's like a simple way for the player to remember this moment, this dungeon, as a moment like that in the story. And like, if you can think about your dungeon in this term, that it's like a story. It's not just, try to think about your dungeon in terms like this, instead of just, this is a maze that you have to fight enemies through and then fight a boss at the end, Just try to find some sort of player narrative in it. I would say that's like a minimum. Like, that's something you want to put in there. The player doesn't necessarily need to understand the narrative right from the start of the level. Sometimes it can develop throughout. So a player exploring an abandoned village might just be walking through it naively for the first half of the level, where the tension is slowly building, and then eventually they wake up that terrifying beast, and now this is like you're being stalked through a village by that huge monster, something like that. In addition, it can be useful to have a secondary narrative based on some mystery about the level itself. This is especially useful if the player narrative is simple or shared with many other levels in the game. Like, I'm exploring the ruins to find treasure, Maybe your entire game, like every part of it, is basically that narrative. So if that same narrative is basically on every single level, and you can't really find a different player narrative, like all of them, it's basically this, then maybe you want to focus on a level narrative instead of a player narrative, right? So yeah, in a game where exploring for treasure is all you do, in a game where like you have one job the whole time, and the way your character interacts with the level is kind of always the same, then instead focus on the level itself having a narrative. For instance, like think of it as like a mystery about this place, right? So, for instance, what happened to this castle that led to its ruin? Or what was the mad wizard researching in this lab? Or what terrible sin did the villagers commit that summoned this monster to punish them? Or what terrible creature was sealed in the deepest levels of this cursed jail? Or are the strange rumors about the forest elves true? That kind of thing. So now it's a mystery. It's a building narrative in the player's mind around this place, instead of a building narrative for how you're interacting with it. It's more like you're exploring this place, and in exploring this place, you're also kind of exploring a mystery tied to it. And then you can try to build that mystery as you explore. You find bits and pieces. You find little hints about the events that happened in the castle before it collapsed, or that kind of thing. Of course, a level can have multiple small mysteries all over it, but it's really useful to have like one big narrative that evolves over the course of a level. So if you have multiple little mysteries, that's fine, but it's really good to have one overarching mystery, or overarching sort of, well, arc over the whole thing, because that makes a level feel like a very like consistent thing. It makes it stick out as like a moment in your head, right? Now, another option is NPC narratives. So that would be a narrative arc that's externalized into a specific NPC, a specific character you encounter, or maybe it could be a character in your party. So say you have this, it's the game that has like a bunch of party members. Maybe you're exploring a place and, there might be like a little mystery about this place, but the real reason for this whole thing is like, as you explore through it, one character in your party is having like an existential crisis or is having a freak out about a recent event. And maybe like the actual purpose of this level is to serve as a backdrop for that character's, development, or that character. Maybe it goes into that character's backstory a bit. Maybe you get bits and pieces of that backstory as you explore, that kind of thing. It could be a party member, it could be a new NPC you encounter, it could be an NPC that only exists in that level too. So this is the more like, this one would be a more typical kind of narrative where it's literally, there's a character here who's talking, and you talk with that character throughout the level, and that's how you build a narrative. So that would be like the more kind of typical kind of narratives, while the others are more like, specific to video games kind of narratives, right? So here's, okay, I kind of lost where I was here. Yeah, maybe you repeatedly meet with a character who goes through some kind of arc throughout the dungeon. So you might be helping them, they might be helping you, or both. Maybe they're sabotaging your every move. Maybe it's a character that ends up being the boss at the end. Or you might meet a friendly character who, over the course of the level, undergoes a terrible change, either like physical one, or just goes from being friendly to villain. Or you could have... you could encounter two rivals, and depending on your decisions, one of them might kill the other, or one might join you, and the other might be like the boss at the end, or maybe they both fight you at the end, or maybe like you have these two rivals you meet, and throughout the whole thing, you're sort of like trying to play them off against one another or something, and in the end, they just team up to beat you up because they're like made up because of your actions. Of course, you could use something like this to like introduce a character that becomes someone core to the story. Like you could introduce a new party member. So if a new party member just joined your party, it would be a really good idea to have a level following this up. That's meant to sort of like introduce them as a character, but also maybe introduce them mechanically. Also, you could use a level like this to introduce a villain or a really like important character in like the setting and stuff like that, right? So here's some examples of NPC stories. So meeting another explorer in the castle ruins who's constantly getting in trouble. Freeing one of the wizard's homunculi who then helps you in battle. Speaking to the tormented souls of the cursed villagers to learn the stalking monster's weakness. Receiving aid from the ghosts of adventurers who died in the cursed jail to find a way out. Or speaking with a forest pixie who wants to become the chief of her clan, right? Now, those narratives might not always be necessary if the level is very short and simple, or just a transition space, like a tunnel connecting two locations or something like this. But if the player is going to be spending a considerable length of time somewhere, it's a really good idea to have some sort of narrative. Another circumstance where a level narrative might not be as high a priority is if some very big and important story or event directly preceded it, right? So like say a big twist just happened, right? And then right after that big twist, there's like a short level. like that level could be kind of like a breather a bit, you know? So maybe like if there is a narrative in this one, it might be a lot more simple. It might be a lot more, basic. It might be like, or it could be more like instead of its own story, it might be like characters, like throughout that level, characters might just kind of comment on the last thing that happened. So it wouldn't be like a narrative proper to the level. It's more like you're using this level as like as a place to just have characters talk about the previous one, essentially, or the previous events. So you're kind of using this level to pace out sort of character moments where they just tell you what they think and all that, right? So here, yeah. So like imagine, like you're walking through a forest after escaping from the villains, and some maybe maybe an important character in your party died, and then maybe like throughout that forest, they just talk. They're just like coming to terms with the fact that this character is dead or stuff like that, right? So it's just that would be like an example of like it's not really like that narrative isn't really the narrative of that level. It's just sort of like the aftershock of a previous thing. Or also the other way around. It could be like something like a level could just have sort of a narrative building that's meant to lead to the next level, which is where like the big twist might happen, for instance, right? So yeah, so basically you wouldn't want to cram in a story in a moment like this that's just like that would distract from the more important thing that the player is meant to dwell on, But yeah, so narratives, I think that is like a big part. If you want to improve a level, if you feel like a level is kind of missing a little bit of personality, ask yourself, does this level have a narrative through it? Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's too abstract. Maybe this is just kind of it's just a dungeon, and it's just a maze with enemies and then a boss at the end, right? Just think about if that might maybe be one way to give it a bit more personality, is try to find some sort of narrative that could happen through it. And I think that will almost always be like a huge improvement on the level. The Dogan. What do you mean? Yeah, this is what I am talking about narratives that happen over the course of a single level. If you're just joined up, like you missed a lot of context here. But I'm done with this section anyway, so you'll be able to check it in VOD. Okay, now let's talk about option paralysis. This isn't really tied to like level narratives. This is more of like general advice about level design. So one big piece of general level design advice that I think is really important for level level designers to keep in mind is option paralysis. It's something to always be kind of wary of. It's very important to try not to overwhelm a player with too many complex options, especially if they have very little to work from to pick one over another. Being overwhelmed with options can lead to someone to struggle to do anything at all, or to opt to stick to the central, most obvious path. I think that this risk is especially high at the beginning of the game, because at the beginning of the game, the player is still figuring out much of the game's world and rules, and like at the beginning of the game, it's a bit easier to overwhelm a player. They're going to be a bit more cautious about what they do because they don't really fully understand how the game works and everything. They're not really like comfortable as an agent in the game world, if you like. So especially early on, you want to keep the early options a bit simpler and then maybe complicate things later. A good way to visualize the problem is imagine the player as having a list of mental objectives in their heads. And every time, so this is the player's head. See, this is the player's head. There we go. Very charming. And imagine that the player just has a list of mental objectives, and every time something piques their interest, they quickly judge whether to go investigate this now, later, or never, right? And they have these list of objectives in mind, and they all have like priorities. They all have things that they want to do first, things they want to do second, and the more that they're juggling in there, the harder it is to sort of figure out where things are, right? So now the player sees a new objective. There you go. If you overwhelm a player with options, this process can really lock up. And this is when you get option paralysis, and everything they see defaults to just never, right? And if one thing they decide to investigate doesn't lead to anything, they can end up being stuck and discouraged, not knowing what to do next. So say you have like a list of things to do, right? And right now, like, and like it starts to be a bit overwhelming, right? And you just have too many, and then you end up doing one of them, and it leads to like nothing. That can kind of like break the process a bit, and they don't know what to do next, and they get kind of stuck. So, especially early on, right? You want to be a bit careful about how quickly and often you present more things for the player to do. And you make sure that the options don't look too neutral. That's a big thing. How you present options is a big part of it. So say the player now, sees a bunch of options ahead of them, right? They see 3 apples, and for some reason they know they can only eat one of them, right? And, if the 3 apples look exactly the same, then this is kind of like a meaningless choice. And if they feel like this is a very important choice, they might be really paralyzed to pick one of them, right? Because they're all like neutral, they're all the same. But say that you theme the apples very differently. Maybe one of them has like a fancy crown on it, and maybe one of them looks like a little devil with like horns and like a tail and an angry face. It's an evil apple, right? And then one of them is like completely normal or something, Now that's a little bit more interesting. Now they're a bit more likely to have like an opinion about where to go, which one of these they want to investigate. If you show the player a bunch of doors, right? It's a really good idea to make the doors look different so that they have like a reason to pick one over another. The more they're neutral, the more that's going to feel overwhelming, right? If you're going to have 3 doors, right? Just giving them a different theme each can really help the player pick one. Or just making one of them big and the other small. Or just grouping them differently. Like maybe one door is off on its own on one end of the room, and the other 2 are like one next to another. They're like close to another, right? So if you have one that's like set apart, people are going to tend to go for that one last. Because the few doors that are grouped together are going to presume to be less important. So they're just going to go for the grouped together ones first and just get those out of the way. And then they'll just do the third one, right? So any sort of thing like this that kind of helps their selection process also helps to make option paralysis sort of less destructive. Now, there's a few caveats here. So if you have 8 doors to show the player, don't show the doors all at once. And make sure at least one of the doors looks very different from the others. Now, as with every other rule, you can break this one. maybe you want the player to feel overwhelmed. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. It's all about being deliberate and understanding how players are likely to react when they see your 8 identical doors looming ahead of them. You just don't want to overwhelm your players accidentally. That's really, all of level design really comes down to making sure you're doing things on purpose instead of accidentally, really. So yes, option paralysis, something you have to think in mind. Just keep this in mind. Option paralysis is one of these problems that can really sneak up on you, even if you have a lot of experience in game development, because option paralysis is one of these things that can be very invisible to the developer. It can be really invisible to the designer, because you know exactly where each door leads. You know which door is important. You know which door they should be taking first. Like, this is all built into your brain. So you're not going to have a sort of instinctual feeling that you're now starting to overwhelm the player with options. To you, it's going to feel obvious. And this is one of the hardest things, like, not putting aside the fact that to you it's obvious is one of the most fundamental, tricky parts of game, game design and level design. Just being able to sort of make abstraction of the fact that you already know where to go is really difficult. You can't unlearn things that you know. And I mean, of course, like it's obvious when you tell someone, well, players won't know where to go, right? But there's a big difference between knowing this intellectually and like really, internalizing that fact and making it part of your actual process. Really realizing that all of your design keeps track of the fact, keeps track of the player's growing knowledge from knowing nothing to slowly starting to understand, And that's a really tricky part. And option paralysis is one of the biggest sort of consequences of failing to do this. Of course, there's more complications to this because, of course, different players are going to have different experiences through your game. So some players might have option paralysis, and because they come from a different direction, Say you have like a big maze. Say you have a big maze, and there's all sorts of paths that players can take through it, right? Then when you get to a certain room, if that room has like 2 doors or 3 doors in it, depending on where the player is coming from, they might be feeling more or less option paralysis from it if they had a bunch of paths before that they decided not to check. Say that there's a bunch of like dead ends here. Say these are all dead ends here that just lead to like bits of treasure or nothing at all. And the player just happens to never check any of the dead ends, right? Say the player does this and then doesn't check up here, just happens to always pick the path that isn't a dead end, right? Just out of luck. That player just never picks a dead end, right? Right? They come here, and then they reach, then again here, they just avoid the dead ends, just completely out of pure luck, sheer luck. And then they get to this room, and then there's 4 different places to go. And at this point, this player is completely overwhelmed because there isn't 4 options in their heads. All of these are also options they haven't explored yet, right? So imagine just how overwhelmed this player is compared to someone that got lucky in the other direction and actually explored every dead end every time and found, okay, these are actually, I can ignore these parts. I already been there. These rooms, these paths basically don't exist for me. I've closed all of these doors. I figured all of it. And then they get here. It's okay. I have 4 options here, right? Yeah, you can do that for sure. You can do all sorts of things to make sure that they check the dead ends first. Or also, nothing can protect you from just sheer bad luck of some players just accidentally stumbling through a path that makes the game more overwhelming to them, there's only so much you can protect. You can't, unless you just make the entire game like fully linear. You can never completely shield yourself from this. This is gonna happen sometimes, you know. Um, and some players are gonna get sometimes a little overwhelmed, and then usually by this point, if they really bought into your game and they're kind of comfortable in it, they'll push through, But that's just, I'm just trying to express here that this is a very thorny problem because, also people are going to have different thresholds at which they're overwhelmed. And yeah, people are going to have different experiences going through the level and blah, blah, blah. All of this makes this a very complicated issue to deal with. So, yeah, just something to be wary of. Okay, you find yourself struggling with narrative for your dungeon because they're very intentionally natural and organic. Okay, well, give me an example of one of them. Maybe we can figure one out. Like I said, it doesn't always have to be like a typical kind of narrative. It can be very player centric, like in the player's head, right? Like they could be following the trail of something. They could just find a scene in the dungeon somewhere and then sort of learn more about what happened there and stuff like that. They could just encounter a weird creature in that dungeon, a weird guy. Well, I mean that kind of builds its own narrative. Like the organs have a purpose, right? And something can be happening in that place that's tied to the purpose of that organ. So yeah, make that. Do you know when you enter a new dungeon? Do you know what that organ is? Because that could be one approach here. You could make it that sort of figuring out what this organ is and what it does could be kind of like sort of a level based narrative every time. Now I don't know what kind of setting this is. Like, are there creatures? Are there intelligent creatures living inside the giant god thing? Because then you can have like literally just regular characters that just happen to be like microorganisms that live in that thing. And you could have like any kind of normal, you can have any kind of like normal, you know, normal narrative with those. It's probably not literally like white cells because I imagine it's a like macroorganism. Is that what how you would call that? When there's a dead god, it's kind of a trope, right? Like a dead god. Yeah, a level inside a dead god floating in space is always good. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if there used to be some sort of society built into that the corpse or something, um, and then you're gonna just have stories about that society and like how they. Another part would be like just discovering how people lived inside that giant organic thing. How people sort of figured out how to survive. Like piecing that together can be kind of like a narrative. You know. Like you're just learning more and more about the weird society they built from inside that giant thing. Yeah, all sorts of things like that. Yeah, another really fun thing could be if you could like communicate with the giant thing somehow. That can be pretty fun too. Especially if that then ties somehow into having the world change in some ways. There's a lot you could do with that. Yeah. Stuff like that can be really fun. But yeah, no, a dungeon that just follow. I mean, I did talk about this earlier. Yeah, sometimes a dungeon can just be a pathway to a more important location. Yeah, yeah. And if it's really short, it might not always be something super necessary, but I think you should still think about it. Now, if it's a pathway to a more important location, you can just use this dungeon as an introduction to that more important thing. You could use that dungeon to introduce something, or to like build up to an important thing, or like to foreshadow an event that's going to be happening in the more important thing. Like, all of that works too. Yeah, like I said, it can be just part of another story too. But if it's something a bit more significant that you spend a lot of time in, this is where like it really should have its own narrative in some way. That's going to make it stand out more as an actual place that players have like some sort of emotional connection to. Like, players are going to remember that place, that moment, if there is some sort of narrative. This is what gets people to remember those places. Okay. Let me just have another little sip, and then we're going to talk about structuring a level. Excited. Very excited. Finally, you guys are going to get a cheat sheet on making good levels. Finally. Okay. So, structuring a level. Does a level start straightforward with a clear goal, or is it more exploratory? How many paths are presented to the player? Will there be an important decision the player must take that changes how the level proceeds from here? Is there maybe a central gimmick or concept to the level design that you want the player to remember this level by? So just like enemy encounters, your imagination's the only limit to what you can do with level design, but it can be a bit intimidating to start designing a level from a blank page, even if you have a narrative locked down for it. So here are some basic kinds of level structures you can use as a starting point, as well as their strengths and weaknesses. And these can be mixed together in all sorts of ways, right? So these are level types, and these are like archetypes of levels that describe an overall structure and concept instead of themes. So this isn't going to be like a forest level or a sewer level or anything like that. It's more, I mean, sometimes these can fit particularly well with one of these, but technically you're going to be able to mix any of those archetypes with any theme, right? So any of those could be a sewer level, any of those could be a forest or a catacomb or whatever, right? We're just talking about the level structure here. So first, let's talk about the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet. Okay, and here is the shape of a gauntlet. You got the start, and then you got big spooky thing, a big spooky thing, big spooky thing, and then spooky skull. That's the boss with red eyes. This is a gauntlet. A gauntlet is one of the most basic and straightforward dungeon structures. It's a series of challenges done in a clear, linear order, right? These are great for tutorials, they're great for endurance challenges, and also for trials to prove mastery over a mechanic, or any part of a game that leads to a really important event or battle. They almost completely set aside any kind of exploration and agency for the benefit of having complete control over the pace and sequence of events. Gauntlets, usually they don't hide their linearity or simplicity, they embrace it. They often won't have random encounters at all to increase focus on the specific challenges of each room. They're great at building tension because each battle is harder than the one before, and there can be a palpable sense of dread building before moving to the next challenge. The most natural kind of gauntlets are going to be bridges and towers. Bridges because it's literally just a straight line and there's no other option. And towers because it's literally like, every floor of the tower is like a different like challenge, and then obviously something scary is waiting at the top of it. But anything, of course, can be made into a gauntlet. Like, you can take absolutely anything at all. But the point here is this. It's these, yes, an arena where you have like a series of battles one after another and you don't have like options. But what's really good about the bridge and the tower, particularly for a gauntlet, is that from the start, you can see how many battles there are. Or at least you have like an idea of like, okay, I'm halfway through. So it's not just that it's a series of challenges, but you kind of have a rough idea of how close you are to the end. And that's part of like building the dread, or building sort of hyping up that finale, right? Well, an arena, you can still, you don't necessarily have this. You can have a gauntlet where you don't know what's ahead. But I feel like that's where it's at its strongest, is when you see what's ahead, right? And you can still do this with an arena where, like, you can just, like, you can be told, like, there are 4 battles left, and you can see, like, your position in the championship or whatever. You can see maybe, like, the things you're fighting are, like, waiting in the seats, and, like, they come down one by one to fight you, right? So that would absolutely make this, like, the gauntlet the way I'm talking about it. All right, so yeah, that is the gauntlet. So yeah, like I said, this can fit any theme at all. It's more about the structure of the level than like the theme or the kind of place it is. Next one, the open field. The open field. So the open field is, and then inside, it's almost the complete opposite of the gauntlet. With a boss, a spooky boss at the end, of course. And you have like these different things. Maybe I should use blue as the starting point. Yeah, I should use blue as the starting point. There we go. Now, the open field. In a top-down RPG, this is more like a normal level that masquerades as an open exterior area. But it's still a maze at heart. It just has a very wide open layout. The navigation challenge is less about finding the right path, but more about like finding the general orientation and finding small structures. So imagine this is like a giant map. And in this giant map, like a giant desert or something, and there's like a few buildings throughout. And then you can enter those buildings, and sometimes, you might be able to enter some of them, or sometimes they might be locked in some way. So even though it's really open, it can still be very linear. A level like this, a level can look really open like this, but actually be secretly really, really linear. Like, okay, maybe say, I'm going to use yellow here for like completely optional, or orange. Yellow. Yellow for completely optional things, right? So maybe like these 2 buildings here are completely optional, and then maybe this one is completely optional too. And then the ones that are not optional, you have to do them in a specific order. So you have to do this one, and then you have to do this one, and then you have to do the boss, right? So that would give you like a place that feels like it's this huge explorable space, but in reality, there's exactly one set of things. Like there's really only one path through this level, right? And the rest is just optional things and just wandering around, right? So this doesn't necessarily need to be open, but it can be open. So this is the strength of, so I was just sort of like improvising here. Let me actually read the text I prepared. So So yeah, it's more like a normal level that masquerades as an open exterior area, but it's still a maze at heart. It just has a very wide, open layout. The navigation challenge is less about finding the right path and more about the general orientation and finding small structures. Finding them in the correct order is where most of this dungeon's structure comes in. A key from one might open another, or a lever in one structure could open another structure up. Buttons can be found. Maybe there's like buttons found all over the area. So maybe these yellow bits here are actually all buttons, and you need to press all three to open the way to the boss or something, right? All sorts of ways to do this. So an open field can be a breath of fresh air after a few dense interior dungeons. They can include a lot of walking, so a slightly reduced rate for random encounters might be a good idea. And yeah, most natural kinds of open dungeons are, going to be like, ruins, swamps, forests, and deserts, and, all sorts of things like that can work. And yes, the really good thing about the open field is that even if it's linear, it's going to feel like it's open. So even if you have a linear set of things that you want to happen, you can use a field to sort of like soften the blow of having a very specific series of things that you want to do. So a field is a really good way to hide linearity a bit. And also, I mean, it doesn't have to be linear, of course. It can be super open. That's what it's natural for. But it's a very open feeling layout, regardless of whether or not the actual thing you're doing inside is going to be like, linear or not. So that's the open field. All right. The maze. Oh, no. Whoops. Sorry about that. I just hit enter by mistake. And that just plays the animation. Okay. The maze. Now, you know what a maze is. Oh, no. Not a maze. And then, I don't know, that's the boss. A maze is a basic path-finding navigation challenge where the player can get lost. Designing a fun maze can be difficult because by their very nature, mazes make for a better challenge when their rooms and corridors are all dense and look alike. They can be complicated further by adding teleportation mechanics, locked doors, traps, one-way gates. Sometimes mazes are complete chaos, and sometimes they're made out of a larger pattern like a spiral or a cross that's blocked or broken in places to turn into a maze. This can make a difference because it becomes easier to keep track of where you are in relation to the larger shape if you can recognize the spiral pattern or whatever. There is an entire genre of turn-based combat games dedicated to mazes, the classic dungeon crawler, which the modern JRPGs are descendants to through wizardry. The genre evolved through games like Dungeon Master, Wizardry 6, and Eye of the Beholder, and even gave rise to what would later be known as immersive sims through Ultima Underworld and System Shock. Although, when playing a JRPG, a maze dungeon feels a little different than these classic dungeon crawls. The top-down perspective gives you a little bit of a bird's-eye view, which can make navigation a bit more easy, especially if the maze was designed with a few landmarks to help the player's sense of direction. You can use items and treasures to guide the player or lead them astray. Since they involve a lot of walking and retracing your steps, it's generally a good idea to give mazes very low rates of random encounters. One potential idea is to have very low random encounters, but place invisible fixed encounters at key points of the maze instead, giving players more encounters the first time they go through, but fewer when they double back. Mazes slow down a game's pacing to a crawl, though, so unless it's an intentional focus of the game. They should be used very sparingly. Sewers are literal literal dungeons make for great structured mazes with geometric rectangular rooms and corridors. Caverns and dense forests can also do well for a more organic, natural-looking maze. So, use them sparingly. Most people are not super happy when they find themselves in a super dense giant maze. You can also think so you can have a simple maze can be essentially a level layout, sure. And it's just a little navigation puzzle. It's not too bad. You can also think of a maze less as a dungeon layout and more like a puzzle. That's the thing. You can really approach a maze as like a puzzle for one room instead of like a full dungeon. Because a maze really is essentially a puzzle. And like any kind of puzzle, if you go really, really hard on one type, that can be a little bit aggravating. But still, it's not something you should completely reject. I think mazes have their place. Just need to be careful about them. Yeah, mazes where you unlock shortcuts, mazes where you can find all sorts of items and things to help you go through. And you might also just want to make a game that has a lot of mazes in it. That's, people who hate mazes are just not going to play the game, and you're just going to have people who don't mind mazes or even like them. Imagine that. Like I said, there's an entire genre that's basically all about mazes, the dungeon crawlers. Of course, mazes and dungeon crawlers tend to be much more simple than the mazes you'll find in a typical JRPG, because in a dungeon crawler, you're in the first-person view, so it's much harder to actually find your way. And because of this, you don't actually need a very large maze to get people lost and have to actually use their heads to find their way. So in a dungeon crawler, the mazes are going to tend to be pretty small. And if you want to make a confusing maze in a top-down game, it's going to need to be big, and that's going to make it a huge chore. Still, one of the worst levels ever made that I often show just when I'm talking about level design is in one of my favorite games ever, Baldur's Gate. So Baldur's Gate 1 doesn't have very good level design, dungeon design, unfortunately. It has a few really great moments that happen in dungeons, but the general dungeon design of Baldur's Gate 1 is dog shit. And the absolute worst that it gets is the final dungeon just before you fight the final boss. And that's what it looks like. That is one of the worst levels. This maze here is filled with traps, too. Baldur's Gate 2... So, no, this game is actually really good. It's just that the level design is its weak part, in my opinion. But the game itself, the rest of the game, is really good. I actually recommend it. But the level design tends to be the level design isn't the best in Baldur's Gate 1. Baldur's Gate 2 has amazing level design. Baldur's Gate 2's level design is top-notch. It is some of the best levels in any CRPG, I think. And also, there is one level in Baldur's Gate 1 that has really good level design. It's a level that was added in an expansion, Durlag's Tower. So Durlag's Tower is one dungeon in Baldur's Gate 1 that's actually extremely good. Super, super, super good. And it was made an expansion, so they had more time, because Baldur's Gate 1, the development of Baldur's Gate 1, especially the last part of the game, was kind of rushed, and you can really see it. You can really feel that it was rushed. And it feels like Durlag's Tower was them okay, now we was them going like, okay, now we can put time in this one. Let's make a really, really good dungeon. And they made a really, really good one with Durlag's Tower. And all of the dungeons in Baldur's Gate 2 are basically on the level of Durlag's Tower. So Baldur's Gate 2's dungeon design is amazing. It's really, really good. Baldur's Gate 1 isn't great. Even the dungeons that are not as bad as this one are still not great. Like, here's one here. There's another one. This is the Firewine Ruins. And again, it's another maze. It's just a big old maze. Now, it's a bit more than a maze. There's a few, like, larger rooms here where you can tell, like, something happens there. Like, there's a few encounters in here, right? But still, it's still kind of dire. Now, there's still a few more. There's still a few that are a little bit better. Like, this one, you can tell that, like, there's stuff that happens as you explore this, right? Like, here, obviously, you can't tell. You can't see exactly what happens, but, like, you can tell that there's, like, events here. This is like a dungeon that has things happening in it. And also, there is a narrative that happens throughout it. And there's a few really good moments in Baldur's Gate 1. And there's a few dungeons that are, like, really fun and brilliant. But about half of the dungeons in Baldur's Gate 1 are, like, dog shit. Like, actually dog shit. Unfortunately. Baldur's Gate 2, they're all good. Baldur's Gate 2 is just firing on all cylinders the whole time. There's a reason Baldur's Gate 2 has been considered the best CRPG ever made for a very long time. I still think it's the best one. I'm reserving judgment on 3 still, because I've only played about a third of it still. And because when I was playing it, I got really busy, and then I just stopped playing it, and now it's been too long. I don't want to go back into it. I would need to, like, start over. You know, that happens. So I'm gonna need to, like, start it over when I get to playing it again. But I did like what I played, but I didn't really, like, see enough to really judge it. I think I barely saw any dungeons actually. Yeah, I would say the mold area in Look Outside. Yeah, I would say that's a maze. It's a very light maze, though. There's very few paths in it. But yeah, that's a maze. I mean, it's a navigation challenge. That's what a maze is, really. I mean, obviously, floor 1 in Look Outside is a maze, too. And it's another very simple one. And you can tell that, like, you don't need much for a maze to be confusing. You just need for things to look similar and for you to not be entirely sure of where you are, right? Like, floor 1 is a really good example, I think, of how you really don't need a complicated layout for something to be confusing. Like, okay, I'm going to show you guys the layout of floor 1. All right? I'm going to show you guys right now. This is a spoiler. I'm sorry. This is the layout of floor 1, right? Okay, this is, I'll just have a big rectangle here. Exclusive. The layout of floor 1, folks. Okay. Want to see the layout of floor 1? That's one corridor. That's one corridor. That's one corridor. And that's one corridor. I'll just fill the... There you go. It's 4 corridors like this. 2 corridors like this. All right. And now here's the thing that makes it confusing. If it was just that, it would not be confusing. The thing that makes it confusing is that, of course, these loop, right? These loop like this. These loop like that. These loop like this. These loop like that. Right? But this one does not loop here. This one does not loop here. And instead, this leads to here. That's the part that makes it confusing. Is that 2 of the corridors is secretly one that extends. That's what makes it super confusing. That one change on what would otherwise just be like a looping map just messes everyone up. Makes it super, super confusing. That's the one thing that makes it from like if it wasn't for this, it would be super obvious to find your way through. But that makes the whole difference. That one little thing that breaks the rule, that breaks the pattern, really messes with your head. There you go. Now you have to don't tell anybody. Shh, don't tell anybody. That was between you and me, huh? All right, so that was the maze. That was the maze. Okay. Next. The classic dungeon. The classic dungeon, it's a CRPG style, feature-rich adventure made out of individual rooms connected with doors and paths, inspired by the experience of classic dungeon crawling and tabletop games, right? So each room is just a new, different little encounter. It's like each room you stumble upon has like a complex setup or a unique character or event in it, or like features for the player to examine or interact with. They're not levels that you're very likely to be lost in or have trouble navigating usually, because the rooms tend to be very strikingly distinct from one another, and they're often laid out in a fairly simple way. Each room may have some different concept, like a puzzle or a character interaction or a handcrafted battle. These dungeons almost always have multiple characters to speak to, both hostile and non-hostile, and often have some kind of story in them. They often have overarching puzzles you solve by finding clues and pieces as you explore and familiarize yourself with the larger level. The classic dungeon, this is the cream of the crop of dungeon design, with a very, very high variety to its contents. This is the kind of dungeon that can eat up 10 lesser levels worth of ideas. This is the very high effort dungeon, right? This is a kind of dungeon where every single piece of it you're spending a lot of time on, right? Like this is a lot of work. It's an enormous amount of work, an enormous undertaking if you want every dungeon in your game to be one of those. This is what the Baldur's Gate 2 is, by the way. Like most dungeons in Baldur's Gate 2 are examples of this type, which is why it's one reason that game is one of the huge favorites of its genre. Here, I'll show you the introductory dungeon of Baldur's Gate 2. Here, I'll show you the introductory level of Baldur's Gate 2. Just trying to find an image. I forget what it's called. I actually forget what it's called. There we go. So this, okay, it's like a weird, come on, can I get a clear one? Come on, give me a clear image, god damn it. Is that better? That's a little bit better. All right, here you can kind of see, just at a glance, every section of this dungeon is like a completely different little thing, right? Like, okay, you start here. This is where you start the whole game, right? And then, like, you get over here. Oh, why can't I zoom in more than this? Ugh. Okay, here. So, you go over here. Here you can get some items, right? Over here, you encounter a genie. You encounter a genie and just have like a talk with a genie who like asks you questions and gives you like weird hints about where you are. And there's like different ways this encounter can go. Either you can like, and it can end up in a battle. It can end up with like him summoning monsters. Just so much stuff. And then you get over here and there's like this place, because this whole place is like a horrible laboratory that's been doing horrible experiments on you. It's like you've been tortured in this place for like months or something at the start of Baldur's Gate 2, and you just broke out because someone's attacked the laboratory, and that gave you like a moment that you can escape, right? And then as you go through, you don't even know who owns this place. You have no idea why they've been doing this to you or all that. All you know is this is a bad fucking place to be in and you want out. And here you're starting to like see the other experiments that they've been doing, and you use this to like piece together a little bit what's happened to you, why you're here. And there's like NPCs here you meet. There's like so many little like so many little like puzzles here. Here you get to like a library full of items. Here you find these gray dwarves, and they like, you can find a portal to like the elemental plane of air here, and it's like a whole thing. Here there's like an optional puzzle that where you can summon a demon. Here it's like the central room, but the central room, like it's sort of like, it's like an access point to everywhere else in the level, but you can only access it initially from over here. And there's a big monster in the middle. An Otyugh, it's like a weird sewer monster thing. There's just so much going on. This is all about introducing the antagonist. Yeah. So there's every room here basically has its own little story, right? But the entire thing, and this is just one of the two, there's 2 floors. There's 2 floors to it. This is just the first one. And like as you go through here, each room has its own little story, but you're also in general learning about your captor. You're learning about like what kind of man he is, what kind of horrible things he was doing. And so all of this also serves to introduce this character. And also it's a tutorial dungeon. This is also introducing you to all the different parts of the game. It's great. It's brilliant. It's a really, really good dungeon. Like Baldur's Gate 2 is a really good game. So yeah. Another notable example is, I mentioned this one earlier, Durlag's Tower from Baldur's Gate 1. It's probably the only really good dungeon of that game. And it is a dungeon like this. It's huge. It's a dungeon like that, but it's an enormous, like multi-level, and each floor of Durlag's Tower has like its own kind of gimmick to it, but also the entire thing has an overarching story of telling you the story of this tower and what happened to the person who built it and why they built it that way. And by the end, like you have a moment where you have to like judge the person who built the tower and figure out what you think about them. And like you have to like judge them because like their soul is on trial or something. It's awesome. It's really fucking good. That Durlag's Tower is really good. But yeah, you can make classic dungeons. Also, Resident Evil games. Resident Evil games are another example of this, of a classic dungeon. It's exactly that kind of thing, right? Like every room you visit in a Resident Evil game has like its own little gimmick. There's always like something. There's always like either it's like a specific type of room that just has like a vibe, or it's gonna have like a battle encounter in it, or some sort of puzzle. Every room has like a purpose. And usually, like the overarching design of the place, it might have some complexity to it. Like you're still sort of finding your way through, but once you're familiar with it, you're not really getting lost because each room has enough personality that it kind of sticks into your brain a bit more, and it's not too much of a challenge to find your way through, right? But yeah, you can make classic dungeons out of just about anything. But large palaces, abandoned cities, and all that are kind of a very natural fit for them. But yes, so the classic dungeon, it is the cream of the crop of dungeons, of dungeon making, but it is an enormous amount of effort. It is a lot of work. So, you might want to keep something like this for like a really important dungeon. A place where, a moment in the game where you're really pulling all the stops. It's a lot of work. It's very intense. But it's basically like classic Dungeons and Dragons dungeon, right? When you play Dungeons and Dragons with the pals on the tabletop, that's like most dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons are like that. And Baldur's Gate 2's the really cool thing is like you can really tell when they made Baldur's Gate 2 they were trying to really reproduce that experience of dungeon crawling with the buds. They were really trying to reproduce that vibe of exploring a dungeon in a tabletop setting when they made it. You know what? I'll take another short break here because my throat hurts again. And if you have any questions about these archetypes we've been talking about, ask away. Yep. Yeah, those will be the maze type of dungeon. It's Lilybat. Yeah, like I said, because those are dungeon crawlers, right? Yeah, those are dungeon crawlers, and yeah, those are mazes. It's an entire genre of games dedicated to that approach. Although there is one. There's a few dungeon crawlers that actually try to go in between the maze and the classic dungeon in their design. There's a few of those. Wizardry 6 and Wizardry 7 are two... more Wizardry 6. Wizardry 6 was kind of trying to do both. Let me show some Wizardry 6 layouts. So Wizardry 6 is a dungeon crawler. It is a dungeon crawler. And many call it, and I might be inclined to maybe agree, that it might be the best dungeon crawler. But it's a dungeon crawler, but this is what it looks like when you go around. And a lot of these rooms, when you enter them, they have like a description of what you find in there. Like a lot of these, like there's a little bit of like a narrative when you first enter them that explains to you like what this place is. Even though visually it's just a basic dungeon crawler, there isn't like furniture or anything. Yeah, it is kind of theater of the mind that way. But like this is a dungeon crawler that tried to make its locations like sort of natural-ish, like they're real places. And like there's a lot of little puzzles designed into these rooms. There's lots of little events, lots of little characters to meet. Yeah, I mean, so dungeon crawlers can try to go for. No. In game, it looks 6. That's 6. Bane of the Cursed Forge, but when you're playing, it just looks like a dungeon crawler. Let me just show you a screenshot. Yes. So you don't see like furniture or anything. Like it just looks like a basic maze. I mean, here's. I feel like 7 has a bit more basic mazes because it's a lot bigger. Wizardry 7 is like a lot bigger, right? And there's like a few like there's cities and stuff, but I feel like the dungeons in 7 are more like actual mazes. While it feels like Wizardry 6 was trying to stay away from just being mazes. Not always. There's some sections of it that are. But yeah, like when you're playing, like it still like looks like a basic, like a classic dungeon crawler, right? So it doesn't visually look different, but it's designed differently. Like the approach to level design here kind of makes it more like they were actually doing a classic dungeon instead of a maze. And you can kind of tell even just with this layout here. Like instead, like if it was meant to be more like a maze, it would be much more like thin passages, thin corridors, like snaking around. But here, you can tell like this is like you can recognize a pattern here. You're not meant to get lost in this place. You're actually meant to figure out. Like you can tell you're not meant to get lost in a place like this. You're meant to be familiar with it as you. That's like the big difference. The huge difference between the maze and the classic dungeon is the maze you're supposed to get lost and struggle to find your way. The classic dungeon, you're supposed to get familiar with it as you explore. You're supposed to sort of figure out the dungeon more and more as you play. All right, so let's move on to the next one. The Funhouse. Alternate name, the Deathtrap. This is the nasty version of the classic dungeon. This is, I mean, it's kind of half between like it's not really like a layout as much as like a theme in a sense, but it's a dungeon filled with trickery, a dungeon with a sense of humor, weird elaborate traps meant to confuse. You can expect mimics and monsters in a box and all sorts of nasty status effects and blah blah blah. Traps like navigation traps, like teleporters and getting stuck somewhere. And yes, no, Sense Fortress absolutely is one. All sorts of ways to like fall down and lose progress. I mean, Sense Fortress is also kind of it's also kind of like a Gauntlet, because you're mostly kind of going up a tower, right? But there's also like some, it's kind of like I said, you can mix genres, like archetypes together. But yes, so all sorts of trickery here. Haunted house is kind of like a haunted house kind of level. If you try to map the different archetypes to Mario levels, this is like the haunted house levels in Mario World. This is like the levels that kind of try to, this is the levels full of trickery and weird little gimmicks. Weird little navigation gimmicks. So yeah, this can be yet a haunted house, the trap-filled temple to the god of madness, a lair of a wicked fae, a cursed carnival. Just about any game can benefit from having one of those. That's always a very memorable moment. Just any kind of trickery-themed level, I think, is a lot of fun. Sometimes it can be like, say, a level where, like, when you come in, it looks like everyone's a friend, It's like it looks like a friendly area with, like, friendly NPCs. But then once you figure out something, like the mask falls, the illusion shatters, and they're all demons or corpses or something. All sorts of... Any level sort of spun around trickery, I think, can make a really memorable moment. Okay, now... let's go into some more types. Let's talk about the wheel hub. The wheel hub. The wheel hub. So let's draw a wheel hub here. Wheel hub. Okay, here's what a wheel hub looks like. You might actually recognize, you might think of some levels that are examples of this. So a wheel hub is gonna be a level like this. You start in the bottom. This is your starting point. And there is like the boss at the end is over here. Spooky skull. And then there's all sorts of paths and challenges. And some of these like might be like big old challenges. Some of these might be simple. Some of these might be all sorts of things, right? So you might think of all sorts of levels that are actually exactly this. And the idea here is that so there's all of these different challenges, and all of these. Some of these might be optional. We're gonna use yellow here for the optional challenges, I guess. Maybe there's an optional challenge here. So this is a wheel hub. A hub focuses around a single central room from which wings of the dungeon radiate out, like spokes on a wheel. The different segments will usually be separate, distinct challenges. Once you complete a challenge, you return to the middle and start another. You might need to clear every single challenge to proceed, or you might only need to clear a few of your choice, or maybe you need to clear some specific ones in an order. Some spokes may be locked until accessible later. Some hubs might have completely fixed orders of spokes to solve, making it like a hub-shaped gauntlet. So you can actually have something like this that is in effect a gauntlet, right? Like say all of these are locked, right? All of these are locked. And except one, maybe this one isn't locked at first, right? And maybe this one, solving this one unlocks this one. And maybe solving this one unlocks this one, and solving this one. So, so you could have something like this that is essentially a gauntlet, where you just have it's just presented in like a circular way, where you see all the doors at the start, right? Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of levels like this. Very often, I've noticed these are often used as like a final level, or like a very late challenges, because something about entering a room and just finding just a bunch of doors is really scary to have early on in the game. It feels overwhelming, so it's it's like a punch in the gut a little bit. Like it's the level design version of a punch in the gut a little bit, you know? Like you open this and it's all these doors, these scary doors. Yeah, there you go. Choice paralysis. Here used for effect. As soon as you start digging into that level, it's going to release a little bit. Like I said, choice paralysis, it's intimidating, it's paralyzing, but as long as you know you're doing it, as long as it's on purpose, it's a perfectly acceptable decision to make. To actually hit the player with a little bit of choice paralysis at the start. Just make it intimidating. So this is why it's very often used for like a final level or very late level. There's a lot of Mario games that have like these like moments at the start where like you choose one of like a bunch of doors with numbers, right? Like Mario RPG has this in the final, what's not the final level, like second to final level. This is there's something very scary about a level like this. So it's a really good thing to do like late in a game. Because it feels intimidating. It feels overwhelming. And so, yeah. So tone-wise, pacing-wise, it feels like it's a level that starts with a punch in the gut. But then as you explore it, you usually realize that it's not that bad. But yeah, it's a very intimidating, very strong start for a level. Now, it doesn't need to be literally one room like this with all the choices like this. This just needs to be, it doesn't literally need to be one room with all these corridors, but it's very often exactly like this. Very often it's exactly like that. Here's a classic example. Doom 2 level Tricks and Traps is an infamous one. Let's see someone play through Tricks and Traps.
Hey guys.
No, come on. No commentary, please. Oh, come on. All right, well, I should have prepared this before.
Greetings, everyone.
All right, well, I'll just mute it. I'll just mute it. I mean, it's Decino. All right, Decino.
2 on the 9 difficulty, plus 1 upset the items. This is map 8, Tricks and Traps.
Yeah.
Alright, map 8.
There you go.
Another classic. We all know about
There we go. Tricks and Traps.
Interesting 2 rounds, by the way, on Nightmare.
It's a very extreme example of this.
I'll show what I came up with. We're gonna grab...
But yeah, so every
fast enough before they...
Every side area is just a different challenge. And you have, some of them you can do in any order. Some of them are locked by some others. It's, yeah, I guess, yeah, the Monty Hall Doom level, sure. But yes, that is... But yeah, there's a lot. This is very much a recurring type of level structure. Let's see. So the central path is, yeah, your progress towards the end is measurable by the state of the central path. So that's that's a fun thing about it, is every time you go back to the center, like, you see your progress visually, right? You see the doors that are still closed. You see the doors you've completed. So every time you return to the middle, you kind of feel like you see that progress, and that can be a really compelling thing. Let me see here. Oh, another thing is sometimes a final challenge may be yet another spoke on the wheel, or sometimes it'll just be the final challenge is just going to spawn in the middle once you do like all the things. So it might not be its own spoke. It might just be like you return at the center and now the boss is there, right? Also, another thing is the central room could repopulate with new dangers every time you return to it. Or maybe when you're halfway through clearing everything, maybe like monsters appear in the middle, stuff like that. So yeah, this kind of setup is all about having this overwhelming start, facing you with just a lot of options for where to begin. And then every time you return to the center, it kind of builds excitement for the finale. And here I have some examples here. Yeah, the final dungeon in Ocarina of Time is something like that. A lot of Mario games feature a hub in the final level for some reason. Yeah, also, yes, the level Tricks and Traps from Doom 2 is a famous example of this. Yeah. Okay, next one is a variant of the wheel hub. It's called the Path Hub. The Path Hub. And here's a Path Hub. And there's a spooky boss at the end. It's almost like a merger of a wheel hub and the Gauntlet in a sense. And maybe you start over here. And then the spokes are along the way. And then there's barriers. And this is the Path Hub. And there's going to be these challenges. So it's a variant of the wheel hub, where the central room is replaced by a linear path, and as you clear side challenges, more of the path opens up. Right? So your progress towards the end is measurable by the state of the central path, and the goal might always be visible in sight. Because the side paths are not revealed all at once, it's kind of like a hub version that reduces choice paralysis a little bit, right? So it's just a way, it's just sort of like, kind kind of keeps down the sheer number of doors you have to contend with, right? Just by progressively opening them up and adding them as you progress. It could be literally like, say there's like a key here, like these doors here, and maybe like this one requires one key to open it, you know? And maybe this one requires 3 keys to open, right? And so for this one, you can do any of these 3 is going to have a key in it, right? So there's going to be a key here, a key here, a key. You just need to do one of these 3, right? And then you're here, and now you need to do 3 of these 4. Or you can also go back and do one of those that you didn't do up back there, right? So you kind of like choose, you like pick your poison. So that's one approach of this. You can just pick your poison. So yeah, it's kind of just a slightly more sort of forgiving, less overwhelming version of a wheel hub in a sense. One thing that can really work well for this is layers of castle's fortifications. A fortified bridge or a river dam or stuff like that. But any long path with periodic blockades can work for this. It works best if the player is always aware of the goal at the end of the path in some way. Yeah, you're a bit less overwhelmed, but it can still be very, like it feels more linear, but it can still be very open. Like, this is actually, compared to some of the others, this has the potential to be extremely open. If you have like a choice of which challenges you take, you know? But yeah, it feels less overwhelmed. It feels like it's like a wheel hub where the options are sort of like paced out to you a little bit more carefully. Now, there's other things too. You can have something like this that isn't actually using like keys to progress, right? It can be something more like just an exploration puzzle here, right? So another approach you can do for this that's very different, that makes it very different from a wheel hub, is say it's something like this, but instead of like finding specific keys and everything, is just one specific path leads here, and then one specific path leads here, and these are shortcuts instead, right? These are just shortcuts you're opening. And so the central path is just sort of a natural way to have a quick path back. While here, the side paths might be very complicated, might be super elaborate, right? But as you progress through, there might be more of these too. As you progress through, like the number of doors you've opened in the middle becomes like this measure of how deep you are in the dungeon, right? So yeah, this central path becomes just sort of like one big shortcut back, right? Yep. Yeah, these can all be their own mini dungeons, for sure. And some of these could be just completely optional. Yeah, that is the Path Hub. Okay, let's continue. There's only 2 more. I'm giving out here. The Layer Cake. The Layer Cake. I need to stop hitting enter. The Layer Cake. That's a fun one. The Layer Cake is a multi-level dungeon where the various floors interact in some way, and where the player gains a benefit from thinking of the space in 3D, such as knowing where to drop down to the floor below to find the way forward, or access to a hidden room. Right? As a counterexample, a classic roguelike, or like the game like the original Diablo, or they're made out of several stacked floors, but those levels are completely independent from one another, so would not count as a layer cake. It's just a series of mazes tied together with stairs. So no, a layer cake is specifically when multiple levels like this interact with one another. And thinking about where you are currently in relation to the others is part of like solving the way forward. So a lot of Zelda dungeons do this. Almost all Zelda games, like classic Zelda games, have at least one level that uses this. It's just a trick they really like doing. It's very common as a Zelda dungeon. There might be puzzles that link the floors together. There might be just a lot of verticality in general. You might use like ladders and stairs to ascend, and chutes and trapdoors as one-way paths down. There might be puzzles linking the floors together. Some rooms might overlook rooms below, or vertically opening doors may lift open below to block the way above. You can also use changing water levels here, so it's a very classic fit with like a sewer kind of dungeon, because you can have like rising or lowering water levels as part of the puzzle here. So a layer cake. It's just a way to think about a dungeon that just sort of like, where the different levels, even though they're completely separate, just kind of interact with one another. Technically, it doesn't have to be like layered sort of vertically like this. Really, just you could generalize this archetype to be more about having different floors connect through puzzles. So there's probably other ways to think of this. But I mean, the most obvious way to think about it is like layered floors that interact like in a spatial way. But I'm sure there's other ways you can think of having several like separate layers or separate areas kind of interact in some interesting way. And finally, we have actually, wait. I think there's a missing one. Uh-oh. We have the building. The building. This is a dungeon made out of a building. It feels kind of weird to think of this as a dungeon layout, but it is like a dungeon archetype. A dungeon made out of a large building with a relatively sensible, predictable layout, with recognizable rooms that make sense. So not very common in older RPGs where dungeons were designed in a more abstract way, but following a sensible building layout can be another like specific approach for certain dungeons, because it makes the advantage is it makes it easier for a player to visualize a layout and sort of make sense of the place they're in. A level like this could have multiple entrances. Once you realize how something is built, like you can, a cathedral, a castle, a library, a mansion. A lot of these can be kind of like classic dungeons because you're gonna have more like themed areas. But imagine a dungeon that's just in a castle, but where you try to put an effort in making it feel like it's a real castle, like a real place. And so you have a dining room and you have a kitchen, and you actually arrange the dungeon in a way that makes sense for that building. It's not just a visual thing that's cool, that's like, oh, it feels like a real place. That's not the only advantage of this. It's also going to be easier for the player to find their way through and to even guess where things are, right? Like once you get the player thinking about this place as a real place instead of like a maze, like an abstract maze, they're going to be able to make educated guesses as to where they'll find the kitchen, Like that's actually pretty valuable. Like all of a sudden, just because you made it look like a real place, the player has a bunch of extra guesses they can make about where things are found, right? And the more your dungeon actually follows that logic, the more they're going to be rewarded for thinking that way. Another really cool thing about this is if a dungeon looks like it makes sense in a spatial way, you can hide secrets in much more subtle ways, right? Like, say there's a mysterious spot here that is not accounted for, that you can't access, right? This is now very suspicious. And you're going to wonder, wait, what the hell's in here? You know? What the hell's in here? And maybe you'll be examining the walls a little bit more closely to find like a secret that opens to like a secret room here. An unused spot in like a regular abstract dungeon is not suspicious. An unused spot, like, normal dungeons have all sorts of wasted space. But if a place feels like it's a real building, then all of a sudden an unused space is suspicious. It's an actual hint. You can just hide all sorts of stuff in a way that you couldn't normally if something looks like a real building. So it's something you should consider. Think of it as another type of, another archetype of, of dungeon. All right, and that's right. And now, so I thought I had actually written out another one. Maybe this is like an older version of my notes. So I have to wing it. The Cursed Village dungeon. The City dungeon. It's one of my favorites, too. I essentially built an entire game on that one. That's what Malison is. It's a gigantic Cursed Village type dungeon. Yeah, someone absolutely could. So, a Cursed Village, simple. It's just it's exactly what you have in mind when you think, okay, this dungeon is a Cursed Village. Think about what it does to a dungeon if it's a Cursed Village. What is that shape like in your head, right? You have a large external thing. You have a large, like, external room, right? And you have all these little buildings. And each of these little buildings, you never really know what's happening inside of them. You're going to explore around and, you're going to enter this one. You're going to check inside and maybe there's nothing. Maybe there's a monster in there. Maybe there's treasure. You don't know. And maybe you go into this one and you meet a weird guy. Just a weirdo. Smiling weirdo. Right? And maybe you go into this one and what you see inside is the worst thing you've ever seen in your entire life. You see in there? The worst thing imaginable. Every single room could have a weird guy in it. So this is the village, the Cursed Village, the City dungeon. What's really fun about this, it's kind of like a mixture of the open field and the classic dungeon, right? This is kind of like, it's a giant playground of mini encounters, right? Where all of these different buildings, they don't need to be buildings. Like I'm describing it as a village because it's easier to imagine it. But you can make like a castle be like this, or you could have like a maze, like an abstract maze, work like this. The idea is that you have all of these little self-contained encounters that you can that you can check on. And every time you open a door, every time you enter a house, you never know what you're going to find in it. It's like It's kind of like a it's like a loot box situation, right? Every time you open one of these doors, you know, it's like you're rolling on a loot table or something, or an encounter table, and you never quite know what's going to be in there. So it's going to tend to be a particularly open kind of dungeon, and it's focused. It's usually not as focused on what's happening in the streets, on like the overarching thing. It's more like a dungeon made out of side quests, a dungeon made out of little self-contained encounters. Of course, you can have an overarching thing. Some of these could be connected in some way, but the point, the main thing that it's trying to deliver on this is like just rewarding your curiosity and delivering all sorts of tiny little micro stories. Every time you open a door, you never know what you're going to find in there. That is the Cursed Village. And yeah, there's a lot of those. Let me think. Some Silent Hill games kind of have that vibe to them. Some Silent Hill games have moments that have this cursed village vibe. Not just because it's literally, it's a cursed fucking village. But I mean, like, there's these moments where you're like... So there's, like, in Silent Hill games, usually there's moments where you're, like, kind of stuck in a dungeon and you're, like, going through one horrible place. But between those dungeons, every once in a while, you're going to have these wandering moments where there's a bunch of optional little places you can visit. And every time you open one of them, there might be something horrible in there, or something weird in there, or some interaction. Resident Evil 3 kind of has a little bit of a cursed village vibe to it. 2 doesn't really. Like, for a moment at the start of 2, you're like outside, but it's basically like a linear path. But I feel like 3 has a little bit more of a cursed village vibe to it. One game that had a really good cursed village vibe to it was The Evil Within 2. The Evil Within 2 has a really, really strong cursed village section of it. There's one moment, so The Evil Within 2, most of the game is kind of linear. Most of the game is kind of straightforward, like mazes and spooky things happening in sequence. But there's 2 moments in that game where you just appear in, like, the streets, right? You're, like, in the streets and there's a bunch of buildings, and you don't have to explore, like, any of them. Each of them has something fucked up happening inside. So if you just pick one at random, something fucked up is going to happen in there, right? And some of them don't have too much, and some of them have, like, a whole horrible thing that happens in it. And, like, every time you open one of those buildings, you're like, there's this tension every time. You're thinking, like, oh, what the hell's going to happen this time? Oh, geez. Every time you're like looking around, you're just afraid of what's going to happen here. And sometimes nothing's going to happen. You have to make it that it should not have something happening every time. Some of them should be a dud, right? There needs to be some moments where, okay, nothing happened. You just got you found nothing, or you found just little bits and pieces or nothing. Because that makes, the moments where something does happen, like, hit a lot harder, right? So yeah, those are really fun. And yes, Malison, the Cursed City is a game that's essentially a whole giant cursed village game, right? It's basically this as a gigantic, as just one giant game like that. And that's Malison, the Cursed City. But yes, so I really quite like this approach. Just a bunch of little self-contained encounters. Alternatively, rewarding and punishing your curiosity. Also, maybe you could think of Look Outside as being like that too. Look Outside is a little bit of a cursed village too. If you think of all, like, these side self-contained little apartments you can visit. Those are all kind of like that too. Yeah, I could, you know what? Yeah. Look Outside really is also kind of like a cursed village. Even though it's just one, again, like I said, it doesn't literally have to be a village or a city. The point is, there's all of these little self-contained places you go to that have their own little horror story happening inside of it, right? But yes, so that is the cursed village type. I quite like this one. Yeah, there you go. You got yourself some some level archetypes, folks. Now maybe you can think of some levels that don't really fit into any of those, but I think this covers like most general, I think that covers kind of most general sort of level shapes. And you can combine them, of course. You can combine these. There's all sorts of ways to combine these. But yeah, this was level design talk, folks. Always love level design talk. I mean, that sounds like a good idea, Dimera. That sounds like a good idea. But yeah, so I hope. My hope for these is the use of these archetypes. Like I said earlier at the start, one thing that's really useful about these is to just get you started. If you want to make a new dungeon and you don't really have like a starting idea, I think just picking one of these as a starting point, just to get you thinking about how the dungeon is going to go, like that can be just a useful starting point, just to get you past that blank page issue, right? You mix one of these with what I was saying earlier about a narrative, and maybe also you slap on like a visual theme, like it's a forest, it's a creepy haunted house, it's a sewer, it's a whatever, right? Just combine all of these, and you got yourself a level concept. That's a good starting point. But another thing I think that can be useful about these is if you have a bunch of dungeons in your game already, and you want to make a new dungeon, and you kind of want the new dungeon to feel different from the others. Looking at these archetypes can maybe help you make a dungeon stand out a bit. If you can think of all of the existing dungeons you have and kind of assign them an archetype, maybe from this you can kind of think of like, hey, there's this, I don't have a, I don't have an open field type dungeon, so that can give you like a starting point. It's not going to be enough to make something feel different, but it can be just one of the things that helps set it apart. Of course, adding a different visual style, having a different narrative to it is also going to be part of it. But yeah, it's a good starting point to just sort of help you make a dungeon distinct. Just sort of like thinking about them in sort of this high level structural level, and just using that to just make its very structure different, I think can help. And yes, Pensive Bread, these are being uploaded. I'm putting them all up on YouTube. This is the fourth of these sessions. The last session was about enemy and encounter design. And the next one, which is going to be next Friday, is going to be about designing bosses. It's going to be about designing boss battles, folks. That should be fun. Yeah, bosses. That's going to be part 5. We're getting close to the end. It's a Frankie Smile Show on YouTube. If you scroll down, you should get a link at the bottom. There should be a link to my my channel videos. Yeah, you've moved away from the cursed village layout. Oh no, that's my favorite. Yeah, I'm sure you can find all sorts of examples of all of these types. Alas. Well, since 1.5 is released now, I might actually have a little bit more time to work on my own entry. Because I do not have anything close to like a completable game right now. You know, I've only worked on this on the streams, and it's just like a few scattered levels. I have not worked at this at all outside the streams. So, yeah, there's like a month left. It's true. But yeah, I ended up spending most of these workshop streams just kind of explaining and talking instead of doing much sort of level design. Yep, that's the idea. That's the idea. We can spend some time at the end of all this to just look through what people made. And even if they're not completed, that's fine. It's not, the idea isn't to like show off completed products here. It's to talk about game design and level design and all that. A good archetype for a starting dungeon. It depends on what your game is like, I would say. I think a good sort of like general, like a good sort of basic approach could be I think it can be a good idea to make your starting dungeon sort of a microcosm of the larger game. Right? So like if the larger game is full of exploration, you might want to make the starting dungeon like a little exploration-y dungeon itself, right? Sort of like to sort of train the player to approach the game in like a curious way, right? Oh, when did they release that? Darinium? No, I don't think I had heard of that actually. Oh, that sounds cool. I would say the wheel hub is probably a bad idea to start with. I would say the wheel hub would be a pretty bad first dungeon usually. Because it's overwhelming. It's like kind of what you don't want the very first, like the start of your game to be. But I mean, you can try. You can make your game. You can decide that your games should start overwhelming. You know, that's a perfectly valid decision. Just know that that's going to be like difficult. Yeah, I would say a wheel hub and a maze. A maze. I mean, if your game is going to be full of mazes, then sure, start with a maze. But otherwise, that might give people the wrong. Might give people the wrong idea. I would say a gauntlet. You know, if you're going to start something, you might want to be kind of like straightforward. If you want to, especially like this going to be like if your game is a bit weird, it might need a tutorial right at the start, right? Um, so if your game really needs a tutorial right at the start, a Gauntlet might be really your only option. Just a basic series of lessons for how to play. Sometimes like you really have no other option. Um, yeah. Did Dark Souls start with a wheel hub? Dark Souls? I mean, you mean like the Asylum? The Undead Asylum? No, the Undead Asylum is pretty straightforward. You do come back to the Undead Asylum later, and when you come back to it, it's like a bit more open. But it's basically a gauntlet. It's like a weird shaped gauntlet. The Undead Asylum. I mean, the Undead Asylum is the main gimmick of the Undead Asylum is, you know, you have like a path that leads to the boss battle, but then you have to run from the boss battle and have like a circuitous path around it, and then you come back to the boss battle now with your gear, and you can attack it from the top, and then that lets you fight. That lets you kill the boss that feels impossible at first, because you got like the weapons and gear along the way that lets you fight it. That's how Dark Souls 1 starts. It's really good. It's a really good intro. Yeah, Firelink. I mean, Firelink is a hub level. That's what you call that kind of level. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Firelink Shrine. Like, I would say though, Dark Souls 2 is a hub game. Dark Souls 1. So now we're not talking about dungeon designs here. We're talking about like general, like large scale game layouts. Dark Souls 1 has like one of my favorites. Dark Souls 1 has like one of my favorites, like larger game layouts. Dark Souls 1, I would describe it as a network game, right? Like Dark Souls 1 is like all of these different areas that like connect to one another, with like one area that reconnects a bunch of them, right? Dark Souls 1's like level design is amazing. I mean, it's like a really densely layered like, you know, Metroidvania. And I think it's amazing. I really, yeah, to me Dark Souls 1 was like the best, like for how it fits into what I like. Dark Souls 1 was the best because it's exactly the kind of level design I like. So yeah, Dark Souls 1 is like, yeah, it's a network, right? Demon Souls is a hub. Yeah, it's a hub, right? You got the Nexus. I mean, it's called the Nexus, and it's got like these different levels in it. But that's more like, you know, and these levels you can kind of progress into them in any order you like right from the start. There's a few things limiting your progress, but and there's one that's broken that you can't access, and like each of these is actually itself separated into levels, and you can progress each of these at your own pace. So yeah, that's a wheel hub right there. Oh yeah, that's a wheel hub right there. And once you complete everything, the center is where you access the final boss too. That's a wheel hub. Yep. Oh yeah, that's a wheel hub right there. But yes, the really powerful thing about Dark Souls 1 is that as you play through it, like your growing familiarity with it makes it feel like home. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of a thing for like Metroidvanias too. Metroidvanias really thrive on being a space that you grow to become familiar with as you play. So that's Demon Souls. That's Dark Souls. Dark Souls 2 is kind of a networkish wheel hub, right? So you have Majula, and Majula has like these different paths coming out of it. I mean, one of them is like literally a big hole in the middle. And like one of those paths is actually an alternate path to this one, which is kind of interesting. Like one of these is like an alternate path to this one, and that's kind of cool. And you can do all of these in any order technically, but like there's a very like these paths, like you're very much invited to check this one first, this one second. Like there's kind of a suggested order to them, but you're not forced to stick to those orders. And then in the end, like the game progresses from one of them. So like one of them has sort of like this whole outgrowth that leads to like the second half of the game, right? And then there's stuff to do here, and then you come back, and then you have to like revisit a few things after you're done. So it's like a weird, like complicated wheel hub. It's like a simplified wheel hub in a sense, but yeah. So yeah, it's essentially that. And then you have Dark Souls 3. And Dark Souls 3 is a path hub. Right? Dark Souls 3 is absolutely a path hub. You kind of have like a core path of Dark Souls 3. Right? But that core path has like these side areas that open up as you make progress. And like there's one sided area at the end. And some of these have their own sort of side areas too. Right? And then the twist here is that the end of the game isn't at the end here. The end of the game is here. Is just that this path here is like the hardest one to get to. Because to open this door right away, you have to beat a boss that's really difficult to beat early on. So you normally have to like go through all the way to the end and then come back to get here, but you can technically fight it right at the start and get to the end early. And that's cool. I like that. That's like I kind of like that every Souls game essentially had kind of a completely different structure from the others. I mean, I think that's pretty cool for a series, that every single one is kind of completely different. I mean, I guess technically Demon Souls isn't in part of the series, but you know it is. We all know it's part of the same series. Come on. And then Elden Ring, well, Elden Ring is, it's an open world game, so it's and there's a thing here, and then there's a thing here, and then it's just a bunch of lumps. I mean, you can still kind of think of them as just little areas connected, but listen, I'm not a big fan of the open world nature of Elden Ring. I think I really like the game and I like the vibe of it and all this, but I feel like it's the best open world game that I've played by very far, right? But I feel like it would still have been better if it just wasn't open world. If you just removed the open world and just pushed all of these areas into like a tighter package, it would have been such a better game. I feel it would have been such a better game. But, I get it, the open world vibe itself has some value. Even if it's sort of, even if it dilutes the level design a little bit, the open space, the giant open space itself has some intrinsic value to it. There is something sort of fun and immersive about just riding your horse, through a field. I understand. It's not like, but it comes at a cost, I feel like by far, I had the most fun by far when I was exploring one of the, the legacy dungeons. I feel like this was by far when the game was at its strongest. And, the spaces between were kind of the weakest of the game. Actually, no, the weakest of the game were like the chalice dungeons. That was probably the weakest parts of the game. But still, it was still fun. I think overall, it deserves the success and praise it got. But still feel like it would have been better if it wasn't open world. Although, if it wasn't open world, it probably wouldn't have been as successful. I feel like the open world, another sort of big benefit of the open world for Elden Ring was just making the game way more accessible. Because the open world just lets you sort of be in this world without being in constant struggle. And also, like, opens up your ability to grind and sort of be over-leveled for different areas. In a way that you can't really be over, like, in if the level design is tighter, you tend to be less, you tend to be more level appropriate for everything. Well, this kind of lets people, just build a little bit of strength before the next big dungeon. So, I think I see the advantages. But, for my personal tastes, for my personal buttons to press, I do wish, I just hope that they haven't permanently set aside making non-open world games, even despite the, world-shattering success that Elden Ring was. I do hope that they'll still consider making non-open world games from time to time. All right, well, that was a little, of course, that was a little aside about Dark Souls, as people need to do eventually. I want them to do a first-person dungeon crawler. I want them to return to King's Field. I said it. I want them to make a new King's Field. Please, FromSoft. Please, give me a new King's Field. I want to see what you do. I want to see what you do to the first-person dungeon crawler. New King's Field would be so damn good. If they made a new King's Field, it would revitalize the dungeon crawler entirely. It would just bring so many more people to the dungeon crawler. Dungeon crawler would just become a AAA genre now. Imagine. That is within their grasp to do. They could just wave a magic wand and make first-person dungeon crawlers a mainstream genre. They could just do that. It's within their power. There's a button in front. There is a button. There is a button on Miyazaki's desk. There's a button he can press at any time. There's a label on that button. There's a button you can just press at any time. And it's the button to make dungeon crawlers mainstream. You can just press it. You can just press it anytime. Beep. Done. Done. Imagine. Yes. Make it a horror game too. Why not? Let's go. Anyway. I mean, if they made it, it would be like King's Field, so it wouldn't be grid based. So okay, purists, dungeon crawler purists wouldn't be interested in them that much because they want the gridders, they want the grid based ones. But I'd just be happy I would just be happy with a good tense well-designed, atmospheric dungeon crawler with top-tier level design. Ugh. Because right now, the dungeon crawlers we get right now, I'm sorry, the dungeon crawlers we get right now, they don't have the best level design. They're okay. They're okay. But it's all just mazes. It's all just mazes. It almost never explores outside of that. It's all just abstract mazes. Come on, give me something more. I know FromSoft would not just do mazes. You know, when they were making King's Field, it was not just mazes. I mean, the first one kind of was. The second one, too. But after that, they kind of moved away from just making mazes. They would do all sorts of shit. Man. Please, FromSoft. Please. All right. Oh yes, someone was talking about animated tiles. What's your problem with animated tiles? What's wrong? What's wrong? Ah. Yeah, I mean right now the most popular dungeon crawlers are like basically the Etrian Odyssey games. And those, yeah, I mean, the the level design in Etrian Odyssey is fine. It's fine. Usually their levels have gimmicks. Usually their levels have like something to make them stand out. You know, but they're still just abstract mazes. I kind of wish they just kind of experimented with more stuff, you know? The wizardry games, the modern wizardry games, I feel like they try to not be just mazes. I feel like they try to have a little bit more. But yeah, Etrian Odyssey games are pretty grindy. Yeah, I usually, whenever I play one of those, I usually stop. I usually like lose interest like halfway through or so. I still have fun. For the half of them that I do play, I still have fun, but yeah, I usually kind of lose interest before the end. Okay, so it's showing 4 auto tile symbols, showing 4 rows, even though the animated tile section. Well, let me show. Let's go into tile sets. So these are the animated tiles. So what are you working on here? Which of these are you working with? So you're trying to do something like this for like water. So this is like animated auto tiles. And it's showing 4 auto tile symbols. Well, the thing is that it automatically mixes some of them together. Because this is meant to be water, right? So this is meant to be water. And this is meant to be deep water that automatically layers on top of water. So it's like this. And then it automatically merges this on top of that in your tile set. And same for these. These here are meant to be things that layer on top of your water tiles. So here it might be like rocks in the water. It might be a waterfall. And this one too. So these, if you want to do something very specific, just don't use these, because these have like specific mechanics to them. The others don't. All of the others are just like you know, auto tiles that work normally, but those first ones here have special rules because they're for very specific purposes. So if you want to make something that isn't specifically like shallow water, deep water overlay, and then various other overlays for water, right? Then just ignore these and only like work with these. Yeah. Make sense? Support dingoes. I'm thinking. All right. No problem. No problem. All right. Well, anyone else have some questions? Maybe about what we were talking about or just general issues you're having with your workshop game? Oh, animated water is tough. Animated water is tough. Usually what I do for animated water... I'm not very good at it, though. Just a fair warning, I'm not very good at it. I start with one base tile. Right? Steel Soldier, have you seen last week's... stream? Because last week's stream... kind of goes into that a little bit. So here's how I do like typical JRPG water, all right? So I start with blue and add some white, and that's going to be like waves. Right? Yeah, so last week's stream kind of went into different like enemy archetypes. I would say just try to have like, you know, a few of these archetypes represented, and I think that should give you a good starting point to at least like get you started on some enemies. And from this point on, like once you get started on some enemies, maybe you'll just get more ideas on variants or different enemies that work well with them. So just start with some of those archetypes. Just start by making some enemies of those archetypes just to get you started. And then, like, I think from that point, it's a bit easier to sort of make the decision of if your dungeon needs more or not. Okay, so I start like this. And then I use the tiled mode. The tiled mode of a sprite is very useful so that you know immediately if this tiles properly. Now, I'm going to, because there's a bit too much of an obvious pattern here. It looks more like tiles than water. It's in view, tiled mode, and tiled on both axes. And that's to help you make something that tiles easily. So that makes it way easier to draw something that tiles. Look at that. Ain't that useful? There you go. That looks pretty natural. And then, yeah. That's why you gotta learn how to use your tools. And then I think of this as like, these are like peaks of waves, right? So I'm gonna try to give them sort of a light direction a little bit. Like that. And let's see. So I just think of these as like the peaks of little mountains in the waves. Right? Like this. Yeah, these are ripples. Now the result here might not look super pretty, you know, but it's going to be a good starting point. Okay, and now Let's try maybe even some and you can give this a bit more directionality by sort of like fading some of the points that are not going in a specific, like you might want to make it more vertical depending on like that might be useful. And like if you try to like mostly have highlights on vertical-ish lines, that might help sort of give it more of a direction a bit, right? Okay, and now, how do you animate this? So you can just give it a direction by just literally shifting it. So let's add some frames here. Now, RPG Maker automatically, this one problem, RPG Maker automatically animates tiles in a ping pong fashion and with only 3 frames. So that means having it flow in one direction is very difficult. So if you want to flow in one direction, you might actually want to use a background instead, a scrolling background. So it's really like the animated tiles are better for standing water that just have like little ripples to them. So let's do that. So I'm gonna add 2 frames. So there you go. We got 3 frames here, and you can select them and make loop section, and then click here, and you can set it to ping pong animation. So now that's going to give you an actual preview of what it's going to look like in game. There's no animation yet here because I haven't actually started animating yet. And what you're going to do for the animation, you're just going to make the circles grow and shrink in turn, right? So you're going to start the first frame here, and you're just going to make it like shrink this circle here and maybe grow this one. And maybe shrink this one. I can preview here. Now this might be a little too strong. Like if like the change is very sudden, that might look a little weird. So you might want to like tone it down if it's too intense. And then you make it do the opposite. So the one that grew here should shrink on the other frame. Yeah, if it's a little too intense, yeah, it might look more like lava. And the thing here is that the crests of the waves should be moving along with it too a little bit, or else it's gonna feel like it's just little. It's gonna feel like it's bubbling instead. Yeah, something like that. And another thing too is you could have one of these. Yeah, I'm not super happy with it, but this is the preview window. But yeah, say you have say you starting to like what it looks like. I don't exactly like here. I would probably start over here, but let's say it's good. Let's act like this is good. It should be view, preview. There it is. And then when you want to make this into the actual tile set, you just copy 4 of them like this. You can drag this into its own window here. You just copy and paste them. One next to another. And then you want to make like the edge. Make the edge separately. And just know that for the edge, you only have the outer like half of the tiles, I think. Right? Only like the other half. So you basically only have like what's here to actually draw an edge. So if you go deeper than this, it's going to appear in like the looping part. Yeah, it's just like a wall. So as long as you stay within the outer half, it should work. And over here we have I think that's it. I think it's that basically. And over here, this is the completely unused thing. This is just for the actual preview. So you don't actually need to do anything here, but you know. And then, yep, you just copy paste this over. And that should work. Bing, bam, boom. And of course, you can also like tweak the edges here if you want the water to interact with the edge in some specific way. You can just do it separately here. But yeah, there you go. That puts you most of the way there. Just do this, but do it well instead of badly, and you got water. There you go. Simple as. Now you know. All right, anything else? Anything else? So simple. No problem. Oh, and all right, so I think that's going to be the end of the stream, unless someone else has questions. All right, before I go, I want to remind you all again, I have a Patreon. I'd appreciate you have a look and consider supporting me on there. And all right, that's going to be it for tonight, folks. Thank you all for watching, and take care.